Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 15, which is going to be looking at life in Nelson's Royal Navy. As always, to give people a bit of a chance to join the stream, I'm going to start us off with a tune.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wall. Your new gods sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love and heed and folly, bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, a loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall wail gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come thou to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all the thankless years.
And that, of course, was our theme tune, The White Man's Burden, sung by Chris Gard. Do go and check out Chris Gard's excellent music channel on YouTube. He's got some really good stuff, including some good contemporary stuff as well. So do go and check him out. I'm hoping we're going to be joined later on by Aaron Hook, who is on another podcast at the moment. He's a popular man. But I am joined this evening by Mitch. How are you going this evening, Mitch?
Same old.
As always. Max Payne is saying link. What do you want to link for, Max Payne? If you can tell me what you want to link for, I might be able to answer your question. Anyway, we're going to be talking about Nelson's Royal Navy this evening. So basically, the Royal Navy in the late 18th and early 19th century. Very well known, of course, because of famous battles like the Nile, Copenhagen, Trafalgar, Camperdown, glorious 1st of June, etc. Really, that period, and particularly the Battle of Trafalgar, gave Britain command of the world's oceans for over the next 100 years, until Britain willingly gave it away in 1922 at the Washington Naval Conference, which we have talked about on this stream. Mitch, did you have anything you wanted to talk about in terms of first thoughts on this subject?
Yeah, you generally get the sense of, like, you have Nelson, who's the main well-known admiral of his time, given Nelson's column, and the Battle of Trafalgar, and the heroism like he displayed. But then you also have like the other guys of the time, like, for example, Thomas Cochrane, who is not really that well known. I mean, it depends on what. I mean, I know in Chile and other South American countries, their navies are based upon Thomas Cochrane having helped them. For example, or you might have, let's say,
True. Yeah, true.
or you might have, let's say, for example, Collingwood, who was the main naval guy after Nelson's death, and people don't really know too much about him. Or you might get
worked himself to death, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, you get, I mean, people don't know about Nelson. For example, he served under Admiral Jervis at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, and you also have who was it? You said commanded at Battle of Camperdown.
Duncan, Admiral Duncan, Scottish guy.
Yeah. So, as much as like Nelson can be lionized for what he did, and he's very much of a romantic hero in that respect, it's also a matter of it wasn't just him, but also like the Royal Navy just generally bred a class of men who were very capable in their own right. So it wasn't just because it's like, for example, the best case example would be something, let's say Carthage in the Second Punic War. You have Hannibal, who's a damn good general, but the rest of their generals were pretty mediocre. Whereas the Royal Navy was completely opposite, where you have brilliant guys like we have a brilliance of Nelson, but it doesn't just massive all the good stats on him, so to speak. It's generally balanced, and there's a whole class of capable men.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you were saying before we went live, Mitch, Nelson had his band of brothers, which were his captains, who understood his tactics and the way he was going to go about things. And they were all excellent officers. I mean, the Royal Navy, as you rightly say, had a huge number of very talented and very competent officers in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And they, in turn, were complemented by very skilled crews for the most part, which is one of the things I want to talk about a bit this evening, because there's quite a lot of myths about the ordinary sailors in Nelson's Navy. Also worth mentioning that you mentioned Cochrane, and of course, if anyone is a fan of the Jack Aubrey novels, which the brilliant film Master and Commander is based upon, the Patrick O'Brian books. I mean, many of Jack Aubrey's exploits are actually based on Thomas Cochrane. And Thomas Cochrane was also unusual in that he was an aristocrat. He was a Scottish Earl. He was the Earl of Dundonald. And that was unusual in the Royal Navy because the Royal Navy was much less aristocratic than the British Army in that era. The Royal Navy tended to be more of a middle-class organization, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and you generally get, for example, like Lord Nelson. Admiral Nelson. He was like lower middle class, or like upper
Well,
working class.
Nelson's father was a vicar in Norfolk, and but he had naval relatives, which is how he was able to go to sea, which was the common way that officers started out. They went to sea as midshipmen, often as young as 12. And they went, and that's what happened to Nelson. And you'd go to sea when you were about 12, if or sometimes 14, and you do that if you had an officer who was willing to take you, a captain who was willing to take you. And obviously they tended to prefer their own relatives, but they would also take friends, boys, as well sometimes. And that was the way you became an officer. You went to sea as a midshipman, and you learnt the job. At first, the midshipman used to have to learn all the ordinary sailors' duties and all the knots and all the rigging and all this kind of stuff that you needed to know. And then gradually they would also be taught things like navigation and the finer points of sailing and what have you. And then after you'd done, I think you had to do 5 years at sea, although there was a certain amount of cheating about how long people spent at sea. Some guys used to cheat, and a boy would be on a ship's books, but not actually on the ship. But you were supposed to do at least 5 years at sea before you could pass for lieutenant, or try to pass for lieutenant.
Yeah, so for example, you have Collingwood. Yeah, he was a midshipman at the age of 18, and then 10 years later he becomes lieutenant.
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah, and you had to pass before a board of, I think it was 3 naval captains, who would give you all sorts of really difficult questions. You know, they'd say things like, "Oh, your ship is is close into a lee shore and it loses all its masts. What do you do?" You had to come up with a quick solution, which in that sort of situation would generally involve putting an anchor down fairly quickly. But you had to answer the questions like that. And then you also had to show your journals that midshipmen had to keep, which included lots of noonday sun sights and navigation and all the rest of it. And then if the captains were satisfied with you, they'd pass you for lieutenant, and then you become a lieutenant. I see AI Shire Homelander is in the chat. I did send you a link, AI, if you want to come on in Discord. But anyway, that's how you became an officer generally. Although ordinary sailors could also be commissioned, and the way they generally did that was via being a master's mate. Master's mates also used the midshipman's berth, and those guys could also go and pass for lieutenant if they were talented enough, and providing they could read and write, of course, which was essential. And quite a few sailors did do that. I mean, the very famous navigator Captain Cook started off in the Royal Navy as an able seaman. Because he'd originally gone to sea on coal ships going from Newcastle that were taking coal down to London. And when he joined the Navy, he was quite successful. And during the 7 Years' War, he was doing things like charting the St. Lawrence River and stuff like that. And that's how he was eventually made a lieutenant.
Yeah, because one myth that perpetuated around myth told me is that basically Royal Navy sailors, all they had to live on was like biscuits or whatever. So, but after Captain Cook especially, he was a matter of skill who was completely eliminated, and the diets got a lot better. Like for example, I believe it was something like I remember reading funnily. So you have Royal Navy sailors, and the Spanish used to complain about this a lot, where Royal Navy sailors would pull up into like Spanish ports like Cadiz, and the women would have the hots for the Royal Navy sailors because they were better paid and better fed compared to the average Spanish soldier. for example.
Indeed, yes, that's true. That is indeed true. And of course, scurvy by the time of the Revolutionary Wars in the 1790s had largely been conquered. Indeed, the Americans sometimes call the Brits limeys, and that's because of the lime juice that the Royal Navy used to have on their ships, and they used to put it in the rum ration, and it was done as an anti-scorbutic to stop scurvy.
Yeah, plus also you would have had like a decent share of meat in Middle East.
The food by the standards of working class civilians. The food in the Navy was quite plentiful, and there were quite a lot of calories in it too, which they needed because it was damned hard work.
Yeah, because you have to because like, one perception of this time is basically, oh yeah, the only thing you could eat at sea was biscuits, because it's like the same goes like because the same stereotype goes also for the army. Most days about, oh yeah, the diet was poor.
No, the Navy the Navy got salt pork, they got salt beef, which actually some modern naval historians have actually made salt pork and salt beef and tried it and say it's quite tasty actually. But yeah, salt beef, salt pork. They got peas, dried peas. They got plum duff and stuff like that, which is a pudding, a dessert. And also, as often as possible, they would get fresh food. Like when British squadrons were blockading the French and the Spanish during the Napoleonic Wars, the admirals would go to a lot of trouble to get as much fresh food as they could for their sailors, because they had to keep them healthy, because if the French or Spanish came out, the sailors needed to be fit.
Yeah, and it's also a matter of like you have. Yeah, I know. Also, I believe it was the spoils of war were a massive thing for sailors. That's one thing that made something like Nelson popular was the spoils of war were enjoyed by and
Prize money.
This is why.
Prize money.
Prize money.
Yeah, prize money. Yeah, absolutely. Prize money was. Sometimes it didn't happen very often, but occasionally even ordinary sailors became pretty rich from prize money.
The best example. Hello, everyone. Sorry, I was going to say the best example was Sir Francis Drake on the Golden Hind when he was raiding the coastal towns and cities of the Latin Americas, the Spanish-controlled towns. And when they got to the Philippines, because he went up to California to find, and he tried to go northwest to find Northwest Passage back to back to the Atlantic, but instead they quickly realized, because the Spanish were on their tail, and they lost I think about two other ships went missing. And when he sailed across to the Philippines, I believe they ran aground because there was so much gold, silver, just overfill, keeping the ship grounded on these coral reefs. So I think they had to like throw some. I think they threw some cannons and some armor and stuff, anything that was heavy. But overall, even though they threw gold and other silver overboard, they still came back with a ridiculous amount of wealth.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And another good example from much later is Admiral Anson and HMS Centurion. Now, in those days, they hadn't yet worked out how to overcome scurvy. So Anson lost a hell of a lot of his guys to scurvy. But what that meant was that when Anson got back, his survivors became quite wealthy. The ordinary able seaman and ordinary seamen became quite wealthy because he captured so much Spanish gold. And of course, Anson was set up for life himself because the captain got actually admirals on stations got the biggest proportion of prize money. And then it went down in terms of the amount you got went down in how high a rank you were. And so landsmen got the least amount and ship's boys. But ordinary seamen got a bit more, able seamen got a bit more, petty officers got a bit more, and it went up through the lieutenants and all the rest of it. But this is one reason why in Britain there are so many pubs that are called Captain So-and-so and Admiral So-and-so. It's usually guys who earned money from prize money and then named their pub after a captain or an admiral.
Yeah, and you can imagine, and it's kind of one of the things where the press ganging thing, there's a lot of false, like there's a lot of
there is indeed that's something I want to talk about in due course, Mitch, for sure. AI, since you've just joined us, and I asked Mitch first, are there any sort of first thoughts you have on talking about Nelson's Navy? Basically the Navy between the French Revolutionary Wars up until about 1819. Oh, we lost him. I'm sure he'll be back. Yeah, did you have any first thoughts about the Navy between the, I don't know, say the 1780s and the end of the 1800s? And he's gone again. Sure, he'll be back in a sec. Yeah, so there are a number of popular myths about the Royal Navy which are not true. Hang on, let's see if we can get AI this time. AI, did you have any first thoughts about the subject?
I am sort of I mean, one of my first things is I think to the, we talked about the Battle of the Nile, that sort of, you know, where you have Nelson in his own right as Britain's best admiral, but also like these various captains on each ships, which are also, these incredible figures of leadership and courage and sort of daring, and also knowledge of the the sea, the topography and geography of the land as well, of nature itself. And it goes back to, I think, one thing that sort of helped Britain, and I think this was a feature with Napoleon, even into his from the end of the Republican era into Napoleonic era, was that so many officers and those in the French Navy, senior officers in there who were part of the aristocracy, were either killed or fled or wouldn't serve.
True.
In the
Very true.
It meant that you had this just people who weren't who just weren't seamen, who weren't military men at all. I mean, you had one cases where I think are you, Andrew, are you familiar with the siege of Toulon?
Yes,
Yeah.
a bit. Yes, I know a little bit about it. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was Napoleon. So he was a corporal in his
It was when he was
artillery.
a lieutenant. Yes.
Yeah, so he was promoted from corporal to lieutenant, and it was through the artillery. And at that time, the British landed with, I think it was a contingent of Spanish and a few French loyalists into the city of Toulon, and they had control over this peninsula, which was then dubbed by the French as Little Gibraltar. And they built the British built a fortification, and the idea was to keep watch over the bay and to protect the Royal Naval ships stationed there. And to sort of open up a new front in France, because the French were currently mainly on the Rhineland fighting the Austrians and the Prussians and such. And in that you had Napoleon, who, from the French perspective, rightfully viewed, we need to capture the British positions there and then we put artillery guns on the peninsula, which then means that they could fire on the British ships, and it basically forced them to withdraw, which is, of course, what all happened. But in the round that, Napoleon faced multiple problems because he probably would have captured it sooner, but you had an officer above him who was chosen by the committee, the department system, the French Republican Committee, who wasn't a military man. He was a painter. He was a painter before the revolution, but was promoted, and so Napoleon didn't have a good time. And of course, at the time, the French Navy itself was in total disarray itself. So I actually think it's quite an interesting period because I think Britain was fortunate that their opponent, because Napoleon changed the military, the army, the land army sort of style and system, through mass conscription, mass recruitment, and restructured it. But I don't think the Navy, the French Navy, really changed from that revolutionary Republican period. It was still largely ineffective and, unchanged.
Yeah, Mitch and I were talking before we went live, and the difference really between the Navy and the Army in that era was that the Navy was a lot more technical. Like in the 18th and early 19th century, a first-rate ship of the line was the most complicated thing that men could make. It was literally the most complicated thing that men could make. And a warship like HMS Victory, for example, which is a first rate with over 100 guns, would have more firepower than all of Wellington's artillery at Waterloo. Like most land guns were 9-pounders. Now, Napoleon had some 12-pounders, which were famously heavy for land warfare. But HMS Victory, her lower deck guns were 32-pounders. Her middle deck guns were 24-pounders. And the lightest guns she had on the ship were 18-pounders.
Yeah.
And so a one first-rate ship of the line like HMS Victory would have more firepower than the whole of Wellington's army at Waterloo.
Yeah, one thing to bear in mind is that the French Navy, they were known for conscripting guys as far inland as like the city of Dijon, nearby which is not far from the German border. So whereas the Royal Navy made a big policy about only recruiting from seaside towns for natural reasons, whereas the French, they would recruit guys from like Alsace-Lorraine and other inland provinces.
It wasn't like the Royal Britain was lucky because Britain's an island, obviously, and we actually have a very long coastline, and we had a very big merchant marine, and of course all the fishermen in those days as well. Basically, when the Royal Navy was trying to get sailors to man warships, they were mostly interested in trained sailors. They didn't really want landsmen because there wasn't all that much that a landsman could do on a warship that was useful. Like they'd form them. Most of the landsmen who either joined as volunteers or were picked up by the press gangs, which by and large, the press gangs were trying to avoid getting landsmen. They didn't want them. But if they did, they ended up in the afterguard, and all the afterguard did was pull on ropes on the deck, which, anyone could basically do so long as you were told which rope to pull on. But the Royal Navy wanted trained sailors. That's who they were after. And the press gangs, for example, were only allowed to operate, I think it was within 10 miles of the coast. In fact, it might have been less than that, actually, and also in major ports. So they for example, there was a press gang in London because it was a major port. But they weren't allowed to roam over the inland areas of Britain to get people. Yes, occasionally magistrates would have criminals turned aboard ships rather than sending them to jail. Although more often criminals were sent to the army rather than the navy, because again, the navy wanted trained sailors.
It's quite interesting because there was when I was in Scotland, when I went on holiday to Scotland, there was a story of a man from Inverness, which is, I mean, it's quite inland, but it's somewhat closer to the coast,
Yeah.
Murray Firth region, and he was press ganged, but the reason was that he was confused. His identity was mixed up with another person. That was the magistrate said, "Oh, this one's a criminal," and yeah, take him away because he's like a repeat criminal, right? Repeat sheep thief, that sort of stuff because of the interclan problems. This is like early 18th century sort of things.
Mhm.
And he was then taken aboard, and it was sort of like a known sort of local story because I think it was quite controversial at its time because he was he was just a normal sort of not well to do, but like I guess you say like middle class type. So this was like a bit of a sort of local controversy, but I intrigue.
Yeah.
I've put in Discord in general, and if you wanted to bring it up, it's a picture of the first ship that I have been on. It's called the Matthew, and it's a it is like a sort of reconstruction of John Cabot's.
Oh yeah. No, I know that. I know the Matthew. Yeah, the reconstructed ship. I know that one. It's a replica.
It's a replica. This one's a replica, and this was the first ship I've been on, and we went out. I guess into the Bristol Channel with it. About what 20 odd? Just trying to think. About 20 odd years ago.
Yeah, that sounds correct. Yeah, there's also a replica Golden Hind, I believe, in London.
Yeah,
which
I've
is
been on. Yeah, been there, and yeah. One thing I remember with the Matthew, which was they said, "Do you want to try out the hammock?" And I was like, "Sure." And it was actually worst mistake ever because my foot got partially stuck. It got partially, and I was hanging upside down, and I had to get my dad to come in and sort of climb up a bit and just to unhook me. So it wasn't a fun experience in that regard, but yeah. The damn thing kept because the boat was rocking a bit. It was like, oh god, I'm stuck. I can't get undone.
I don't know what your picture is. I don't know what sort of picture that is, AI, but it won't. It won't work. It won't work on StreamYards, I'm afraid to say. But if people in the chat want to look up the Matthew, you can put it in Google and find it easily enough.
Yeah,
that was Cabot. That was Cabot's ship that he went to Canada on, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's the one. And it's it's a small, fairly modest size captain quarters. Quite nice, nice little small. But it's a small ship. It's there's actually if people find an image, you can find some couple men standing on it, and it gives you a proportionate size to it. And
yeah, it's quite small.
It's quite small indeed. Yeah.
A warship that I would recommend people go and visit if they're in Britain is HMS Trincomalee, which is a Royal Navy frigate from this era, and she's beautiful. And I can thoroughly recommend that one. And of course, HMS Victory, which is the world's oldest commissioned warship. Although they're repairing and doing all sorts of stuff to her at the moment, and it seems to be endless. I don't know when the hell they're going to finish, but they're taking a long time doing it. So hopefully, once they've done it, she'll be good for another 100 years or so.
I've seen the Spanish flag captured at Trafalgar. The massive naval flag captured. Riddled with cannon and musket holes and slightly burnt as well around the sides, sort of. But That was quite impressive. That one.
Yep, it is. HMS Speedy, Alfred Bierman is mentioning in the chat, and that's in. If you read Master and Commander, the first Patrick O'Brien book, that is very closely based on Cochrane and HMS Speedy, which was a brig, by the way, little brig. And she captured quite a powerful Spanish frigate. That was much bigger than her. She had, I think, 18 guns, and the Spanish frigate was a 36-gun frigate. And Cochrane and Speedy captured her. But if you read Master and Commander, the first of the Aubrey Maturin books that Patrick O'Brien wrote, that is very closely based on Cochrane and HMS Speedy. So yeah, do check that out. Although in the Maturin books, the brig is called HMS Sophie, but it is based on HMS Speedy.
I just found out. Oh god, this is horrific. I've just found out that the Matthew was then it was docked in Bideford, and people, if they ever went down there, before 2012, remember it would sit there opposite a nice classical imperial British hotel. And then it was in 2012 relocated to the M Shed in Bristol, where you got all like the fucking hippie bars and stuff. And it's like,
I know Bristol. I lived there for a little while, long time ago, very long time ago.
That's sad.
In St Paul's, you could play Spot the White Man even in the 1980s. 1990s. You could play Spot the White Man in St Paul's in Bristol. God knows what it's like now. God knows what it's like now. The only good bit of Bristol is around Clifton with the suspension bridges.
Yeah, Clifton is still quite white. It is still quite white that up around that area. I went there last time I was Bristol about 2 months ago. Went along the city centre, the harbour front there, and it was filled to the brim with Indians and Bengali. And no joke, on the bus, I used to park and ride, right? The bus. And this isn't me just being racist or anything for the sheer hell of it, but it literally just smelled of like spices and curry. It was really like sickening smell.
I used to go to the Clifton Hotel, and you could sit on the terrace there and drink Pimm's and look at the Clifton Suspension Bridge, the Brunel Bridge.
Yeah. I've been over hundreds of times. Yeah.
But yeah. But anyway, getting back to our subject.
Yeah.
Bit of a digression. But the press gangers, as I say, they were only really allowed to operate quite close to the coast and around major ports. And they really were only after seamen. The Royal Navy was not really interested in getting landsmen. And also, one of the reasons the Navy got far less criminals than the Army did was that criminals were a big problem on a warship, because if you had a thief on a warship, most of the ordinary sailors only had one locker, which you couldn't lock up really very easily. And so a thief on a warship where everyone was living hugger-mugger very close together was very, very unpopular with the sailors. And it was people like that, and also habitual drunkards who used to end up getting flogged. The vast majority of Royal Naval sailors were never flogged. Whereas you would get particular guys who would be flogged like every 3 months or so, because they were always in trouble for something, quite often because they were drunk or whatever. Don't forget, the Navy also, of course, were given rum rations in those days. So it was, if you saved up your rum, and if other sailors were willing to give you some of their ration, you could quite easily get drunk.
Yeah, I know there was Admiral Collingwood, who, as a general policy, he forbade flogging on his vessels, because apparently, like at his school, I can't remember what kind of school it was, but like.
They were called Blue Lights, Mitch. They were called Blue Lights. They were religious guys.
Yeah. But you used to have flogging at schools, and Collingwood the only place of practice. Although stuff like this that kind of reinforces the idea that, most sailors got flogged. And so, well, no. Because the thing about a ship, of course, you're packed onto a ship for months on end, or perhaps even years. You're going to want people who can behave themselves. And the people on the sailors on a ship will generally self-regulate. So you won't have to flog them too much. They can police one another fairly well.
Yeah, it's pretty. The vast majority of sailors were never flogged, and some Royal Navy skippers were known as flogging captains, but they were very much the minority. I mean, like Nelson, for example, when he was a captain, was not a big supporter of the lash.
I mean, I guess I'm just thinking about it. If there was like one particular person who was known to be a thief, and a troublemaker, they would kind of be socially isolated by the rest of the crew anyway. So that because as Mitch said, you'd be on the ship for months and months at a time. It would unless you were like a complete sort of like a Sigma mindset thief guy on the ship. You would need that sort of other interact. Well, you need that to have that other interaction. You couldn't just be like a lone wolf type character.
Don't forget the seamen were all in messes of about 8 to 10 blokes who would eat together and sleep next to each other and all the rest of it. And as you say, you needed to be community minded, shall we say?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of press gangs, Iron Duke. And this is something a stream that we'll probably talk about in the future, but the 1812 war, the War of 1812, one of the justifications by the United States government was the impressment of US ships by the Royal Navy.
You mean US sailors, but yeah.
Yeah, sorry, US sailors. Sorry, I got them mixed up now. US sailors. By the British Royal Navy.
It did happen occasionally. Although you also have to remember that a lot of British seamen served on American ships, and also there were American consuls around the world who were quite easily bribed to give a British sailor American citizenship.
Yeah, now wasn't it? What was it? The one that Jefferson would write about, which was like the American cry, was the Chesapeake. Was it the Chesapeake affair or whatever it was called? There was like some boarding of the Chesapeake and
no, it wasn't the Chesapeake. It was
oh no, well, am I thinking of a different?
It was a different ship, and it was HMS Leopard. I can't remember what the American ship was now, but it was HMS Leopard, which was a 50-gun ship. Aaron, good evening, mate. How are you going?
I'm well.
Yeah. Did you have any first thoughts on Nelson's Navy?
That it was a remarkable recovery from the aftermath of the American Revolution, and that it did quite well in a situation where Britain was essentially continually at war for the best part of 25 years.
Yeah, I mean, during the American War of Independence, the surrender of Yorktown was largely because the Royal Navy managed to lose control of the sea to the French, who at that time had a pretty good navy. Although, as Mitch and I were saying earlier, the French ruined their navy during the Revolution by either chopping the heads off their best officers or making them flee.
Yeah. And just to add to something that AI was mentioning about the War of 1812, interestingly, when the Americans declared war, the British had essentially given the Americans everything they wanted, and it was on sort of all the diplomatic notes were on a ship across the Atlantic.
At some stage, we'll do a stream on the War of 1812, but basically, from the American point of view, the Americans thought they could invade Canada and take it over, and that was the main war aim of the Americans in the War of 1812. And they failed in that dismally. They invaded Canada 3 times and were beaten 3 times.
Yeah, And you would have thought they would have learned the lesson from the American Revolution itself, where they failed to take Canada then as well.
Well, and it was even worse in the War of 1812, of course, because many of the loyalist Americans had fled to Canada, and they didn't want to have to flee again.
It is quite amazing because a lot of the American politicians they believe that the Quebecan majority Catholics would be absolutely opening arms to free them from the mainly Protestant dominated British rule in Canada, but instead it was the complete opposite, because what they didn't take into account is how many of these Quebecans connected the American Revolution to the French Revolution. Now, of course, there is a lot of difference into what came out of it, and the American Revolution never went to the extreme insanity of freedom and equality that the French went to.
Although it was much more violent than some people would have you believe, particularly in terms of loyalist civilians. But
yeah. I mean, a lot of that stuff was covered. You had the Continental Congress, which and one of the things that Washington had to contend with was the Shea Revolt and various other revolts to put down the more extreme elements from the Revolution, and there were quite a few extreme sort of from the Patriot point of view. But I mean, that's going off to a different point. But the point is that Canada itself, as Aaron Hook mentioned, there was literally zero appetite, and also on top of that, you had the various Indian confederation that was fighting the Tecumseh, the famous Indian war chief, who was fighting the Americans anyway, who allied with the Brits, and I think even did he become a commissioned officer? Or was someone in that become a commissioned officer in the British Army?
Could be, but we're wandering a bit off topic here. And as I said, we will at some stage do a War of 1812 stream on this series, but I'd like to stick to the Royal Navy if we can, for the most part, at the moment. And there were quite a lot of interesting things about the War of 1812 in terms of naval stuff. However, as I say, we've been going for about 48 minutes, and I'd like to concentrate on doing the Royal Navy stuff, and we will definitely do War of 1812 stream at some stage, particularly AI if you want to come on as a guest. But yeah, so where were we? We were talking about press gangs and the myth about that. We were also talking about flogging. Now, there were one or two bad Royal Navy captains who were mostly eventually got rid of by the Admiralty, by the way, who did flog their guys all the time. There'd be things like, the last guy off the mast would be flogged, which was ridiculous because that was always the guy who was highest up the mast, obviously enough. But there were some bad captains like that. But they were very much the minority. In most warships, I've read quite a few books about the Royal Navy in the Nelson's era, and on average, floggings were quite infrequent and were not a lot of, guys would be given like 6 or a dozen lashes or something like that, which was not all that many. You get these if you watch some Hollywood movies, etc., you'll get the impression that Royal Navy sailors would get 500 lashes and what have you. That almost never happened, and certainly not in the Napoleonic era.
And just on flogging, one thing that people should sort of remember is that this was the flogging, so corporal punishment was a common use of punishment across society. So when flogging was used in the Royal Navy, as with the British Army, the men weren't necessarily opposed to it. They expected it in a way because they would have been birched or other way or receive other sort of corporal punishment.
Yeah, it was very common, Aaron. And also, as we were saying just before you came on, because warships were quite crowded, and you didn't have a lot of private space, thieves and people of that nature were detested by the seamen.
Yeah.
Because you if you had a thief on board, nothing was safe, you know. And guys would have a locker, but very often it wouldn't even be locked, you know.
Yeah.
And so the sailors themselves were in favor of like enforcing discipline in that sense. But the vast majority of Royal Navy sailors were never flogged. You know, you got to remember, like a warship like HMS Victory, a first-rate ship of the line, would have 700-800 guys on it. And you know, most of those guys were never flogged. And there were also lesser punishments. For example, guys could have their grog stopped. And grog was what the sailors got, which was rum diluted with water, basically. The reason, even today, Australians call alcohol grog in the same way that Brits say booze, is because for a long time in Australia, the only alcohol you could get was grog off of ships. But yeah, so you could have your grog stopped. Obviously, when you were in port, you could be stopped from going ashore and all this kind of stuff. But also there were quite a few incentives to be a sailor as well. Royal Navy ships, the food was generally better than merchant ships and more plentiful. And again, Mitch and I were talking about this before AI and Aaron joined us. The food on board Royal Navy ships was actually pretty plentiful and was not as bad as people think it was a lot of the time. For example, when squadrons of the Royal Navy were blockading the French and the Spanish, the admirals would go to a great deal of trouble to get as much fresh food as they could for their men, because they needed to keep them fit and healthy, because if the French and Spanish came out, they needed to be fit and healthy in order to fight.
Yeah, on the point of the grog, I know, to use a modern example, so there's a guy online who I know, there's a Russian fellow I know online who served in the Russian Navy, and he said that his ship for like a couple of weeks, they didn't have any deliveries of cigarettes, and this nearly caused like a mutiny among the sailors, because of course, you know, sailors love the cigarettes in the modern day. You can imagine if you were punished by having your grog stopped in those days, that just really singled you out as generally just getting. You got robbed of the same pleasures that all your comrades would be enjoying, and it served home a lesson. You didn't have to get a single whiplash or anything. Just having a grog stop would do enough of a job of just properly punishing, let's say, insubordination for argument's sake.
Yep. Also, Royal Navy pay was not as good as in the Merchant Navy, but also there were a lot more men on a Royal Navy ship, and so your workload was probably less for the most part, because of course a Royal Navy ship not only needed to be able to handle all its sails, and that required a lot of men with a square rig ship, because everything was done by manpower, literally. But a Royal Navy ship also had to fight its guns, so there were a lot more men on a Royal Navy ship, and that meant that your workload was actually probably lighter than on a merchant ship.
And during the Napoleonic Wars, and well, the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, I would imagine it was a lot more steady pay for sailors in the Royal Navy than it would be merchantmen, because they knew they were at war from 1793 to 1802, and then from 1803 to 14, 15. So I'd imagine they would.
Very true.
Better,
very true.
They gainful employment was plentiful in the Royal Navy.
Good to see Patriotic Archive in the chat. I've got one of your tunes to finish us off with, Patriotic Archive, if it plays. It doesn't always, but we'll give it a go. Patriotic Archive's got an excellent music channel on YouTube. Do go and check him out. He's got a lot of naval tunes, military tunes, also quite a lot of folk music these days as well. But the pay was regular, Aaron. You're right about that. And also, of course, in the Royal Navy, you could get promoted. Like an ordinary seaman could be promoted to able seaman, and that gave him an increase in pay. But you could also then be promoted to petty officer of various descriptions, and again get an increase in pay that way. Much more easily than in the merchant navy, by the way.
The point about piracy, I mean, piracy was always I'm pretty sure piracy was always standard, for example, with the Caribbean by like 1750 at the latest.
Yeah, it was pretty well wiped out, mainly by the Royal Navy. Actually, it was still a thing in the Far East. Around the Chinese coast, for example, piracy was still a thing in the 1930s. It was also a thing in the 19th century around Borneo and that sort of an area. There were lots of local pirates around that sort of place. But in the Caribbean, as Mitch says, by the second half of the 18th century, it was practically wiped out, and it was mostly wiped out by the Royal Navy.
You also had the other one was the Barbary trade, which often you'd have like a case of the Royal Navy having to bombard. Was it Algiers or Oran?
Yes, Algiers was one of the main Barbary pirate ports. Yes, and the Royal Navy did bombard it quite a few times. The Americans did as well, actually.
Yeah, that was I think that was the only war that Jefferson actually sponsored. That was the only war Jefferson actually supported, was dealing with the Barbary trade, because I believe he was bothering the Americans. Given, I think it was like because the Barbary trade. One reason why we had. I know that there were quite a few seaside towns in this country. Like you had, for example, the small village in Ireland called Baltimore, which got raided by the Barbary pirates.
Yes, they would go there and raid for white slaves. Yes, they would.
Yeah, so you had a situation where, and perhaps it's rather hobby, but you can imagine quite a few seaside towns probably were eager to serve in the Royal Navy just because they thought, okay, we needed to ward off any such slave raids. And the Royal Navy was probably the best means of warding off, let's say, the Barbary pirates. Because
there was that, but then, sorry, Mitch, you carry on, mate.
The only thing I was going to say was because I know that, for example, Admiral Blake, he was frustrated from acting upon it in the reign of Charles II. But so I can imagine, certainly by the time of, let's say, Lord Nelson's prime, you can imagine the Royal Navy is much more in a position of gunboat diplomacy. Like, we can just send a few send a few ships of the line to a Barbary port and just say, knock it off, or we'll burn your city, like we did to Copenhagen.
I think it was 1817 when Britain basically broke the Barbary pirates totally. Like, after the Napoleonic Wars finished in 1815, the Royal Navy then had the time and the spare ships to do it. And I can't remember the admiral who did it now. He was quite famous in the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah, I think it was Pellew.
Yeah, it was Pellew. If anyone's watched the TV show Hornblower, which is very good, by the way, they're really good shows, and they're obviously based on the Hornblower novels. And Pellew is the captain in that. He's the captain of the Indefatigable, which was a big frigate. Although the ship they use in Hornblower is much too small, but anyway, Pellew in 1817 took in a big British fleet and absolutely beat the shit out of the Barbary pirates, and they were never a power after that.
Yeah, there's an interesting connection with Pellew that he's. A great distant ancestor of his was one of the white slaves at the beginning of the 18th century with the Barbary pirates.
Interesting.
He actually got returned. There's a book called White Gold, which talks about his story. It's well worth a read if you've never heard of his story.
They, in earlier days, not so much in the period we're talking about here, which is the late 18th and early 19th century, but in earlier times, the Barbary pirates used to sometimes go as far as Iceland to pick up slaves. And, there were tens and thousands of white slaves in the Barbary place. And they would particularly, obviously, raid in the Mediterranean, places like Greece and Italy and what have you.
Yeah, the very famous one in Ireland was the sacking of Baltimore in the 1530s, I think it was. So in the 1630s, where they pretty much took everybody. The place was only a handful of people were able to escape. They pretty much took everybody in the town.
Yep. Loaf for Sheffield is saying the same thing there, Aaron, in the chat. Carried off in the night. But yeah, eventually the Americans did send an expedition there, as someone mentioned in the chat earlier, to Tripoli. But it was actually the Royal Navy that finished them off just after the Napoleonic Wars, when the Royal Navy had the time and spare ships to do it, basically.
And now we've got slave. Now you got slave markets back in Libya.
Indeed, yeah. After our wonderful thing of getting rid of Gaddafi, which was a big mistake, but there you go. But slavery is on the up all over Africa at the moment. Strange to say, now it's all independent, and it's on the up and up, and it has been since the Brits and the French largely withdrew.
Yeah, the transatlantic slave period is ridiculously overrepresented in history. So many people view it as like the time where significant portions of, populations were enslaved, and it really wasn't. I mean, I think the only time you could say that there was in the West huge amounts of slavery in a very large quantity was probably the late Roman Republic. If I was to just
it was pretty common then. Yes, that's true.
Because I think at the time of like the Spartacus rebellion, it was like that 20-30% of the population was slaves in Italy.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very common in the ancient world. But then, again, maybe at some point we'll do one of these streams, one of our history streams on the suppression of the slave trade, which was mainly, again, something the British did and mainly something the Royal Navy did. But we'll do that at some point. But
we should have done
until the Brits did that. Like all nations and all races had slaves. I mean, if you look at the 19th century and you look some of the British expansion in Africa, some of it was done to suppress the slave trade, because the Africans and also, of course, the Arabs were big slave traders.
Zanzibar in Eastern Africa, yeah, for example.
Absolutely, and of course
Tanzania,
as late as the 1920s, the Royal Navy was doing anti-slavery patrols in the Gulf and the Red Sea, because the Arabs were still taking African slaves. But but they never ended up with lots of them because all the blokes were castrated.
Yeah, I suppose that ties into another point though, about why the Royal Navy was so effective in this period was because we had naval bases dotted all over the place, or we annexed new ones. For example, Malta was annexed. I think because it was it Lord Nelson or one of his subordinates who took up. I think it was someone like Edward Berry, if I remember correctly, or someone else who took over Malta, because the French took it off the Knights of St. John first, and then we took it off them, especially after the battle.
That was before the Battle of the Nile, Mitch.
Oh, I thought it was after the Nile.
It may have been, but we started besieging it beforehand, but we took it afterwards and then kept it and took into the 1960s. And then I believe Malta wanted the Brits to stay, but the British Labour Party wouldn't do it and ran away. Much like we're doing to the British Indian Ocean Territory today.
I know what happened with Malta was there was a referendum on whether they'd be a part of the UK or not, but it was actually the Colonial Office under the Eden government. They did the referendum. The majority of those who voted in it were in favour of being part of Britain, but all the nationalist parties refused to boycotted it until the Colonial Office sort of decided it wasn't worth going with it, and so Malta didn't become part of the UK.
Which was a mistake because it was a very useful naval base. But anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, you have a better. I mean, was Sierra Leone in our possession? Because I can imagine you have like
Sierra Leone was where the Royal Navy used to send the slaves that they freed from the Atlantic slave ships, which in the 19th century they were mainly Spanish and Portuguese, also some Americans, but mostly Spanish and Portuguese. And all the slaves that they rescued, they used to send to Sierra Leone.
Yeah, because that's one factor as to why the empire expanded so much. It's kind of like you have, for example, it's like my famous quote: "The empire was created in a fit of absent-mindedness," and that's probably one. And because the thing was, our Royal Navy, in order to operate worldwide, we had to have naval bases like the Falklands or Malta or Cyprus.
Particularly once coaling became a thing, Mitch. The great advantage of sailing ships, of course, was that they didn't need fuel. And so the only limit on how long a sailing ship could stay at sea was really its supplies and its water.
Well, when you still need...
It was food and water that was the limit on a sailing ship. But once coal became a thing and engines and steam became a thing, then Britain needed all these coaling ports all over the place. That makes sense. Patriotic Archive says the capital of Sierra Leone is called Freetown. Yes, indeed it is. And it's because that was where all the freed slaves were sent from the Royal Navy ships. And the Royal Navy sailors used to get head money. For every slave they freed, they got a bit of extra money.
Yeah, and it's I know that with the West African squadron in particular, they had an obscene death rate. I think it was one of
because of tropical diseases mostly. Although of course guys got killed because the sailors and the Royal Marines would also storm the slaving bases, and so guys did used to get killed fighting. But as I think you're saying, Mitch, the rate of death from tropical diseases was pretty high, actually.
Yeah, like 5,000 sailors altogether, I believe, in the 1830s, I believe it started operating, and then it was like it's still operating into like the Edwardian era.
No, we actually the anti-slavery patrols actually started in the very early 19th century because Britain banned the slave trade quite early, certainly before anybody else did, and then eventually in I think it was 1833 that slavery was outlawed in the whole of the British Empire, and the British taxpayers actually paid compensation to all the slave owners.
Yeah, that debt was on
years. It took years and years and years to pay off. Yes.
About this time 5 years ago, this as well, the BLM crowd when they were on their sort of rampage, pushed this lie in the UK that Nelson, that there was this these letters from Nelson to this plantation. You know which one I'm talking about, in Jamaica. And that he was basically on the side of keeping the slave trade going and everything, and it was just a total lie. It was total forgery, it was a total forgery. There's no evidence to suggest Nelson was ever in favour of slave trade. And also, like Captain Cook, we discussed before, his family came quite relatively humble middle class. They weren't from any notable landed gentry family that would require slavery.
Nelson's father was a vicar. He was a vicar. He was not a rich man.
there's no evidence to suggest that he even had. Actually, I looked into it. I don't think he ever really said anything about it. I don't even know what his views were on it. He may have been against it. He may have been for it. Um, I don't know, but there's no evidence to suggest that he was like this. This while he was quite a famous figure in his later life and career, that he ever advocated for keeping slavery.
Well, and if anyone stopped slavery, it was the British Royal Navy. If anyone stopped it, it was the British Royal Navy. This
Yeah.
and look again. AI will do one of these streams about slavery at some point, or slavery in terms of Britain and the Empire. But slavery was always pretty much illegal in Britain.
And also, it was unpopular from a financial, because many people felt that it was undercutting, the agriculture sector and other sectors within the British markets, and it's similar to why there was if you look at people like say Julius Caesar and co. They played on a lot of the anti-slavery thing, not because of some sort of moral question, but because of the financial impact it had on the citizens. And it's the same thing really that played on here in the UK as well at the time. Slavery was unpopular, but not for. I mean, sure, you had like small, like religious Quaker or some sort of Christian moralist groups that did it the whole on the morality of it, but on the whole, it was financial. The why people were opposed to
For
it.
sure. Yeah, no, absolutely, for sure. But I mean, one of the things that pisses me off is that people go on about Britain and the slave trade when Britain was by far the first country to stop it. Britain was the first country to stop it. Long before everybody else did.
Should have done what the Arabs done and castrated the buggers, and we wouldn't have to listen to them complaining nowadays.
Well, yeah, in Minecraft. Anyway, don't forget, we're on YouTube. We're on YouTube. But anyway, again, we're a bit wandering off our subject. Woodpit 420 says, how often did ships need to be serviced, or could they do it all at sea? Ships did need to be serviced, but not wooden ships, but not all that often. And a lot of it could be done at sea. Like every ship had a very skilled ship's carpenter and his carpenter's mates who could do a lot of that stuff. One of the things you had to do was British ships were the first ships to be copper bottomed. And the reason they put copper on the bottom of the ships was to stop the growth of weed and shipworms and all that sort of stuff, because that would very much slow a sailing vessel down. But even that, you could careen your ship, which would mean taking it into shallow water and tipping it over on one side and then on the other, and clean all that crap off. Once you had copper-bottomed ships. And again, that's where we get the expression, when something's good, we say it's copper-bottomed. That is a naval expression and goes back to that. But a lot of this stuff could be done at sea. But from time to time, they would go into shipyards and they would get serious repairs and be examined and all the rest of it. So Mitch and Lothar Sheffield was saying that the debt for paying off the freeing of all the slaves in the British Empire, which was in 1833, was only paid off in either 2011 or 2014. There you go.
Yeah, it's kind of one of the things where we don't get any appreciation for it. But certainly about it. I'm trying to remember that in Master and Commander, didn't I say that in terms of, let's say, repairing a ship, let's say, because they made first contact with Acheron, they're able to repair the ship somewhat by the shoals.
Yes.
So you can imagine, like, there would be a lot more flexibility in terms of, like, so let's say repairing the ship, where certainly by the time of coal ships, like steam ships later on, that's where the Royal Navy needs to annex more ports in the world. So, which is why.
Yeah, once you get iron ships and you've got steam engines and all that kind of stuff, then everything becomes a lot more complicated, and there's a lot less that the ship itself can do to repair itself. But a wooden ship was actually quite capable of repairing itself. I mean, look at some of Captain Cook's huge voyages in HMS Endeavour and stuff like that. He once ran up on a coral reef and was able to repair his ship. He ran up on a coral reef in the Great Barrier Reef off Australia.
And that was close because the wind and the tide was, I mean, it was close because there was a good chance that it would like completely capsize, wasn't it? When it was on the
it could have happened, but it didn't because Cook was an amazing seaman and a really good navigator, and he was able to basically repair his ship with the resources of his ship and what they could get from the land. Bill Tavern in the chat is asking something about the Spanish Armada. Bill, we will definitely do one of these streams about the Spanish Armada at some stage, and we'll go into that in a bit of detail. But yes, some of the Armada sailors were not treated very well afterwards. Queen Elizabeth I was notably tight with money.
Yeah, she was also quite known for mailing a letter so that Drake would never receive it, but he gives a plausible deniability because she was also quite in any case, let's say whatever Francis Drake did went wrong with the Spanish. But like, in terms of let's say reprenishment, I mean, let's say for argument's sake, you have a Royal Navy ship, say from Portsmouth, they have to make repairs off the coast of Brazil. When you have to worry about logistical, but because for example, I'm trying to think what kind of trees would have in Brazil, for argument's sake, and would they be suitable for a Royal Navy ship in most days? Because our ships, of course, famous for like oak and whatnot.
Yeah, but you in an emergency, Mitch, you could use various different woods, and also the masts were not oak. The ships were often oak, not always. For example, HMS Trincomalee, the preserved frigate that I mentioned earlier that people should definitely go and visit if they get the chance. That was built in India, I believe, and is teak, I think. I think she was built teak rather than oak. But would Pitt 420 is saying, could they set a new mast out of a port? Yes, they could. They absolutely could. The ships were quite capable of putting a new mast in place. Using the other masts as kind of like cranes in order to get it into place.
Yeah, I was going
to say in the aftermath of any like battle at sea, has there ever been like recorded moments where for a ship, the winning ship to sort of cannibalize another ship to either that they just captured or they partially sunk at all? Is there any like records of that?
I'm sure that did happen on occasion. But what ships would generally do if they were damaged in battle is they would jury rig stuff. So ships would carry spare spars, which are the things that the sails hang from that you put up the mast. They would carry spare spars. They would also usually carry spare topmasts, which are the smallest masts highest up on the ship. And they would carry these things. And if they lost a mast, they could always use either a topmast or one of the biggest spars as a jury mast. And they were fully capable of doing that.
Mm.
And every ship, as I say, had a skilled head carpenter, which was one of the standing officers of the ship. He was a warrant officer, and he was one of the standing officers that always stayed with the ship, even when a ship was in ordinary, which is to say in reserve. The standing officers, which included the gunner and the carpenter and the sailmaker, etc., and the master of the ship, would all stay with it, even when it wasn't operating. and they would like keep repairs going and what have you until she came out of ordinary, which is to say, being mobilized. If you go to Scotland, you can visit a frigate. I think she's in Dundee, but I'm not absolutely certain. Called HMS Unicorn, and she's actually roofed over. And the reason for that is when she was launched, which was fairly late. It was after the Napoleonic Wars, and she's a frigate. And that's what they used to do when ships were in ordinary. They wouldn't put any masts on them, and they would roof them over so that the rain and all the rest of it just ran off them. And if they were needed in an emergency, that roof would come right off, and they'd put masts on her and mobilize her. But if you go and visit HMS Unicorn, and I think she's in Dundee, I'm not absolutely certain, but I think she is. And if you go and visit her, she's always been in ordinary. She was when she was launched, she was put straight into reserve and was never actually mobilized. So she's always been like that, and that's quite good because it means that she's almost entirely original under that roof. So that's worth checking out. One of the other great incentives for sailors to join the Royal Navy was prize money. If you captured an enemy ship, whether it be a warship or a merchant ship, so a French ship or a Spanish ship or a Dutch ship in the Napoleonic Wars, or an American ship in the War of 1812, you got prize money. The ship would be sold, the enemy vessel, and its cargo, and all of the members of that ship would share the prize money. The captain obviously got the most money, and then the lieutenants, and then the warrant officers like the carpenter and all the gunner and all the rest of it that I was just talking about, and then down to the petty officers and then the sailors. And if you were a frigate, if you were on a frigate, which was a single deck warship like HMS Trincomalee or HMS Unicorn, your chances of prize money were much higher than if you were in a ship of the line like Victory, for example, because the frigates used to range all over the world's oceans, and had much more chance of picking up enemy merchant ships as well as enemy frigates and what have you. And you, even as an ordinary sailor, as we were saying earlier at the start of the stream, you could actually make quite a lot of money that way. And for this reason, good frigate captains, people like Pellew, for example, that Aaron was mentioning earlier as an admiral, when Pellew was a captain, he was a frigate captain, and he never had to use press gangs because he was a very successful frigate captain who captured a lot of enemy shipping, and all these sailors made a load of money. And so successful frigate captains like Pellew and people like Cochrane and what have you, and there were many of them, these guys would just put out flyers around seaports saying, my ship's going to sea on such and such a date, go to this rendezvous, and all the good sailors would go and join that ship because they could actually make themselves quite wealthy.
I wonder how much of the board then. I was going to say, like, because there's a famous Ernest Shackleton who advertised it that, like, wasn't promising good pay, but he was promising a good adventure and good recognition in the event of success. I wonder how much of Royal Navy played into that in terms of recruiting like volunteers.
Oh, I'm sure that was true. I mean, young men, Mitch, always want adventure, and if you were a young guy and you wanted to go and see the world, there was no better way of doing so at the end of the 18th or early 19th century than joining the Royal Navy. And it was a lot healthier than the army, because the army would get sent to the West Indies and die off like nothing from tropical diseases. But it was much safer being on a ship because you were out at sea and you got less mosquitoes and all the rest of it, Like the reason the anti-slavery guys got a lot of guys dying from tropical diseases is they were often operating, in order to stop the slave trade, they were often operating in African river mouths and stuff like this, where they did get bitten by malarial mosquitoes and what have you.
Yeah, because you can imagine with you have a prize money, which of course that would have incentivized a lot because it's like it's kind of like you can read about like Caesar's legions where if whenever Caesar were to raise a legion, there were plenty of volunteers because they could trust the spoils to be shared generously, and
Yeah.
likewise battles of the Royal Navy was like you have were there any like famous examples of like Royal Navy captains or even admirals who were just like stingy with the loot, or was it just a matter of if you were in any case stingy with the loot whatsoever, you'd be punished for it by Admiralty? Because you can't
Yeah,
imagine like
it was very strictly organized, Mitch. Everyone got their shares, which were worked out beforehand. The guys, there weren't that many naval fortunes, as we were saying at the start of the stream. The Royal Navy was a much more middle class organization in terms of its officers than the army. Aristocrats mostly served in the army. You did get a few, like Cochrane, who was the Earl of Dundonald in Scotland, who were aristocrats, but they weren't all that common in the Navy. It tended to be more middle class in terms of the officers. But the guys who did make naval fortunes tended to be admirals, because if, for example, you were during the Napoleonic Wars, you were the admiral on the West Indies station, for example, you would get a share of all of the prize money of all of the ships that were operating in that area. So, if they captured a French ship or a Spanish ship or a Dutch ship, or during the War of 1812, an American ship, the admiral would accumulate a portion of all those funds. So the naval fortunes that were around tended to be admirals. But occasionally a captain would make a lucky capture. He'd capture a Spanish ship that was full of treasure being sent from South America to Spain or something like that, And in those cases, even the ordinary sailors made quite a lot of money. As we were saying again at the beginning of the stream, this is part of the reason why there are so many pubs in England, or at least there used to be when England had a lot more pubs, or Britain, I should say, not England. There was a time when there were like hundreds and hundreds of pubs in Britain that were named after admirals or sometimes captains. And that was usually sailors who'd made enough prize money to when they left the Navy, they were able to buy an inn or a pub.
well, I mean, I imagine that the Navy was largely English because I know like I know there was some Welsh Royal Navy says, and they were poetically named Morgan, which of course, because the name Morgan in Welsh assumes defender of the sea or the guardian of the sea. So
Yeah.
a Welsh sailor being named that, like the famous Henry Morgan, I believe his name was, like famous pilot.
Yes, it was the guy who the rum is named after. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, and then you get Scotland, which you got the shipyard, but like Scottish strike more as an army kind of but then again.
No. Actually, there were lots of Scottish sailors. I mean, Mitch, we were talking early in the stream. One of the neglected battles of the Napoleonic Wars of the Royal Navy was Admiral Duncan at Camperdown, where he had a very hard battle with the Dutch and did eventually beat them. But he had a very hard battle because he didn't have the best ships. They were mostly blockading the French and Spanish. And of course, the Dutch were notoriously hard fighters. But Duncan was a Scottish admiral. And his captains and admirals used to have what was called followers. And these would be junior officers who would often follow them from ship to ship, or if they were an admiral, also that way. But they also included some ordinary sailors, like the captain's coxswain, for example, who was in charge of his boat when he went ashore and went out to the ship and that sort of stuff. Captain's coxswain was always a follower of the captain and went with him from ship to ship. And Duncan, because he was a Scot, he had a lot of Scottish followers, and also quite a lot of Scottish seamen as well.
Yeah, because I know what I mean. I know one thing that
don't forget, Mitch, that the Scotland then, as to some degree even now, had a very big fishing industry, and much bigger then than it is now. And also, back in those days, they also had quite a big whaling industry as well.
yeah, I know like Glasgow, for example. I mean, was it? I think they were called second city being involved, third city being involved, something on the back of because they
Yeah,
were a massive port.
Glasgow was a huge seaport. Yeah.
Yeah, and so because I know the other thing was I know that with Cochrane, I imagine this was a standard norm, but one thing about when it like because they'd often like reward sailors also for let's say for example, someone like Cochrane would have he would promote men for example if they learned like let's say he were to have sailors who knew languages like Danish or Dutch, so he could then deceive French ships.
For sure.
By
For sure.
then so it's one of the things also where.
And of course, Cochrane was another Scotsman, by the way. So yeah, there were plenty of Scottish sailors in the Royal Navy. There were also a fair number of Welsh sailors in the Royal Navy, and there were some Irish sailors, but the Navy was much less Irish than the Army.
Yeah, I always. I mean, with Ireland, I always took. I mean, I can imagine, let's say Dublin and a push having some sailors on account of it.
Oh yeah, no, it would because that's the seaport. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, you take areas like Connacht or. I mean, I don't know about also in terms of because I mean you've got Belfast, but also been a massive shipyard. But like you imagine areas like Connacht or Munster just being a lot more recruiting there for the army more than anything.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. The army was a lot more Irish than the navy, but there were certainly quite a few Irish sailors, and there were some Irish officers as well in the Royal Navy. Strictly speaking, of course, if they were Catholic, they weren't really allowed to be officers in the army or the navy, but there always were Catholic officers who just kept it quiet, basically. Patriotic Archive is saying Cork as well, which is, again, another port. Absolutely. But yeah, the people from all over the British Isles were in the Royal Navy. I think it was you, Mitch, it might have been AI, who was saying there were quite a lot of Royal Navy sailors from the Channel Islands, for example.
Yeah, what is his name? I can't pronounce it.
Saumarez.
Yeah, I can't pronounce.
Yeah, it's Saumarez. I think it's Saumarez. I probably can't pronounce it properly. Do you know it, Aaron?
I think Mitch got it right.
Saumarez?
Yeah, I think that's how it's pronounced.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, he came from Guernsey, was it, or Jersey? I think it was Guernsey. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Guernsey. Because it was like his family were a lot of. I mean, his family had a long line, for example, of men like becoming midshipmen, like joining the Navy as like midshipmen at the age of like in their mid to late teens. It's not the same with
the Channel Islanders would have been quite popular as well because many of them spoke French.
Yeah,
which would have been quite useful if you're on a Royal Navy ship that was blockading Toulon or somewhere.
Yeah, I know another one was John Jervis. I didn't know John Jervis was from my neck of the woods in Staffordshire because the thing was, his father was a barrister to do with the Admiralty, I believe, or one of the naval forces anyway.
Well, that would explain how his son went to sea, doesn't it?
Yeah, and what's more, Jervis actually absconded from home in order to join the Navy, and it was under Admiral Townsend in 1760s. I think it was during the 7 Years' War that Jervis actually joined the Royal Navy, and there was Admiral Townsend. I could be wrong, but the name Townsend strikes a bell with me. I could be wrong, but I think it was the admiral who fought at Quiberon Bay or some other naval battle in the 7 Years' War. But yeah, Jervis, that's how he joined the Navy. He legit absconded from home and joined the Navy without seeking his parents' permission, and he just got an admiral to sponsor him, essentially.
Yeah, that was, as I said, that was the main way that people went to sea as midshipmen, which is training officers, basically. And, a training officer would go to sea when he was maybe 12. And then by the time he got to, I don't know, 18 or so, he would then go and try and become a lieutenant. And as we were saying earlier, that was, you had to have all your books and journals and navigation stuff. And then you'd go before a board of 3 senior naval captains who would examine you and ask you all these quite difficult questions, putting your ship in an almost impossible position. What do you do? And if you satisfied those guys, then you became a lieutenant. And once you became a lieutenant, that was cool, because if the war stopped or for some other reason you didn't have a ship, you were then entitled to half pay when you were on the beach.
Yeah, I think was it Edward Berry, I believe it was, who I believe like for 5 years after the Battle of the Nile, he was on half pay for a number of years, and he got disgruntled about it. And Nelson just like told him, "Well, just keep it calm." And eventually, I think like the Admiralty has to swap leadership for Berry to be given another ship, like another command, because I think it was something. I think it was Berry who, he struggled to, it was Berry, and it was only HMS Agamemnon for Trafalgar. That's right, he was his next command after the Battle of the Nile. But the other thing was what's his name, Hollum from the Bastion Commander, because he was 30 years old as a midshipman, which because they made somewhat a point about the fact that you can clearly tell the guy just wasn't suited for leadership, because if you're 30 years old and you're still a midshipman, that kind of tells that there's a problem with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you were pretty incompetent if you were still a midshipman at that age.
Yeah, because you got facts.
I think one of the episodes of Hornblower has one of the episodes of Hornblower looks at one of these guys who's one of these older midshipmen, and he tries bullying Hornblower, and in the end, Hornblower challenges him to a duel. And again, like the Aubrey Maturin novels, quite a lot of the Hornblower books are also based on people like Cochrane.
Yeah, I'm trying
to. Sorry, Aaron, you were trying to say something?
I was just going to say that was actually the first episode of Hornblower where that happens.
Was it? I didn't realise that. Yeah. I've seen them all, but I watched them out of order. So yeah. Woodpit 420 is saying probably a good route to become middle class or even upper middle class. It was, but it was also possible to join as a sailor, and providing you could read and write, which was obviously essential, and you could learn navigation, which was fairly complicated and required a fair bit of mathematics back in the day, because you're taking sun sights and all this kind of stuff. Providing you could do those things, it was perfectly possible to join the Royal Navy as an ordinary sailor and be promoted to an officer. And the way you did that is via becoming a master's mate. And the master's mates would mess with the midshipmen and could eventually also pass for lieutenant, which is how Captain Cook became an officer, for example. And Captain Cook came from a pretty poor family in Yorkshire. Mitch, Aaron, you haven't said much for a while. Sorry, you carry on.
I was going to say, like, you have a ship's mate, master's mate. Now, I always get confused with ranks, but essentially, they're basically between midshipman and lieutenant, because, for example, you have Collingwood, who, while he was trying to become lieutenant, he got promoted from midshipman to master's mate, and of course that put him in. That gave him some responsibility in regards to navigation.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm trying to think of which year was it when you have, because you have in Master and Commander, you have those young lads, they use them as sextants, which is kind of like it's kind of like a scope, but you have to take into account like the rotation
It's how you take the noon sunset. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's often how sailors were able to ascertain their position on a map. Because, for example, let's say the sun was a certain angle or something, you could tell what day, as well as
I was just gonna say that, Aaron Hook, but I see you answered it in the chat, so there you go. It was indeed a Hawaiian islander who knocked Cook on the head.
Yeah, I think what's funny was the Hawaiians they attempted to make amends for that by putting a Union Jack on their flag. That's why the Hawaii to this day still has a Union Jack on their flag, because apparently that was to make amends.
It does indeed still have a Union Jack on it. Yes. So one American state that has a Union Jack on its flag. It's true. Aaron, AI, you haven't said much for a while, guys. Anything you want to bring up?
Yeah, one thing that I would like to bring up is that though it's not portrayed very often in fiction of this era, one of the common sort of practices of the Royal Navy in terms of its when it was actually in action was not necessarily fighting sort of broadside to broadside with French ships. It was actually coastal raiding. So more groups of men going ashore, raiding port, raiding coastal villages, and generally harassing the French. Which
they'd knock out signal stations and forts. Yeah. The Navy was also pretty good at doing what were called cutting out expeditions, where they would take their rowboats into a port and cut out an enemy warship or merchant ship. That was also quite common.
Yeah. I've always wondered why that isn't necessarily portrayed very often. Because if you're doing a film or a TV series, that would be a great source of action to be shown on screen.
I'm pretty sure there's a Hornblower episode where they do that.
Yeah.
I think there is.
Yeah, I think that's Frogs and Lobsters.
That's a very good episode, actually. That's the one where there's a British Army regiment as well.
Yes.
And the Royalist French are bloody hopeless, yeah. Which I believe they were for the most part.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, no, Hornblower is an excellent TV series. Obviously, Master and Commander is much the best movie there is about Nelson's Navy. It's very well done. There's also HMS Defiant, which is a pretty good film, which is about the Royal Navy. There's a Hornblower film, which stars Gregory Peck as Hornblower, which he's not too bad in. It's not a bad film. And then, of course, there are several versions of Mutiny on the Bounty, of which the last one is probably the most accurate one that Mel Gibson did. One of the few Mel Gibson movies. Actually, that's not true. I only hate what is it? I hate the Americans. Yeah, The Patriot is terrible and is completely ahistorical, and also Braveheart is crap as well. But his Mutiny on the Bounty with what's his name? Who's the other guy in that, Aaron?
Anthony Hopkins, I think.
Anthony Hopkins is the guy playing Bligh, and Bligh was actually a pretty good officer, and he was quite a successful captain in the Napoleonic Wars, and eventually became governor of New South Wales, I believe, in Australia.
Yeah, and also he was with Cook for quite a few voyages. I think he was actually with Cook.
Yeah, I think he was. Yes, I think he was. I remember when I used to go to the Imperial War Museum in London, I used to pass his house because it had one of those blue plaques on it in Lambeth in London. It was a nice 18th century townhouse. God knows what it's like now, because London's shithole now. But back in the day, when I used to go to the Imperial War Museum, I used to walk past his house quite often. But Bligh was not an arsehole at all. Actually, he was a pretty good officer, and he took his open boat thousands of bloody miles from way out in the Pacific all the way to the Dutch East Indies. He was a pretty good officer, actually, and not an arsehole particularly. It was the guy who Mel Gibson was playing, who was Fletcher Christian, who was an arsehole, if anyone.
Yeah, and there's a question about genetic inheritance, given what Fletcher Christian's descendants will get up to on the Pitcairn Islands relatively recently.
And Pitcairn, of course, is still a British island to this day.
Yeah.
You can find a few videos of people visiting it on YouTube if you're interested. And some of his descendants still live there.
Yeah.
No doubt the Labour Party will be giving it away in the near future, but at the moment it's still a British island.
Well, maybe not, given the how should I put it, the interesting children that people on that island seem to have. The Labour Party will probably defend it in the name of LGBT.
I think that's much exaggerated, Aaron. And the story that I read, because I looked into this like a few years ago now when it was something of a scandal, it was some feminist British cop they sent over there that caused most of this shit.
I've read some of the accounts of the victims, and I'm less, shall we say, likely to believe it was some feminist cop.
Well, that was the story that I read, man. It was all started by some woman feminist, ultra feminist woman policeman who was sent there from Britain. But that's what I read. You can agree to disagree if you want to. But
yeah.
I'm inclined to believe that the woke British cops are a bad story wherever they go, including all over England. But, there we go. They're more interested in arresting people for tweets than they are for criminals. But but again, we're going a long way off our subject here. We're trying to talk about the Royal Navy. So, but yeah, so the Royal Navy was nowhere near as bad as it is sometimes portrayed in popular culture. And as I said, one of the other things about joining the Navy is you could get promoted. It was not that difficult, particularly if you could read and write, to be promoted to petty officer of some sort when you got more money in terms of pay. But of course, you also you got more prize money as well when you captured enemy vessels. Interestingly enough, I'm going to be doing a stream with Aaron on Sunday, Aaron?
Yes, it's 10 p.m. British time. Yeah, we're going
to be doing a stream looking at the third of the Patrick O'Brian Aubrey Maturin novels, HMS Surprise.
Yes. And this should, with any luck, be the first of a number of live streams we'll be doing. We're sort of looking at some of the other books which are just. I'll just get myself in.
Absolutely, I'm up for that, Aaron. If you want to do more, I'll do more. People, strange to say, people often suggest HMS Surprise as the best book to start with, even though it's the third one in the series.
Yeah, I think it is a good entry to try because it gives you a good sense of the whole sort of series. If you understand what I mean.
I'm going to have to head off now because my dog wants to go out. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you can't neglect your dog. Thank you very much for joining us, AR. You're always most welcome, mate.
No, it's great. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you around.
Bill Tavern is asking, how many Marines could a deck cannon kill? Well, I presume you just mean sailors and Marines because, there were Marines on all Royal Navy ships. And it varied with how big the ship was. Like a first rate like HMS Victory of 100 guns would have about 100 Marines on board, but then a small frigate like HMS Surprise, which was a 28-gun frigate, not very big, would probably have about 25, 30, something like that. And some smaller ships, like things like sloops, which was a bit smaller than frigates, they would have 18 Marines on under a sergeant. They wouldn't even have a Marine officer. But anyway, how many would it kill? Depends. Normally, ship's guns fired solid round shot, and that would kill as many people as it hit, basically. But also on warships, when it hit a wooden warship, it would create splinters. And some of these splinters were huge. And those things would be what would kill a lot of guys, would be the splinters. Then again, sometimes guns were double shotted, so they'd have two solid iron cannonballs in them if it was fairly close range. And then again, if it was very close range, you could put canister and grape in the cannon, which turned the cannon into a gigantic shotgun, and that could kill quite a lot of people. And again, create splinters, which would kill more guys as well.
Yeah, I remember like one vivid detail that I think was at Edward's Bury at the Battle of the Nile, right? Because he was beside Nelson as he fell, and of course, apparently I think it was something like it was either Nelson or Bury himself who got hit by a fragment of a guy's brain because of how because of all the cannon shot and like splinters and whatnot. Like even to the point where
I certainly remember one guy I read about, Mitch, who was hit by a guy's teeth that were knocked out of his skull, and he was hit by the teeth. I certainly remember that.
Yeah, he was. I mean, he was certainly not a lightweight task to be had if you're on the top deck of like let's say first rate ship at battles like the Nile or Cape St. Vincent or Trafalgar. And it's like,
they used to call the main gun deck on a warship. They used to call it the slaughterhouse when they were in action because it could resemble that sometimes. Although fortunately, the French tended to fire on the uproll to try and damage the British ships' masts and yards and sails, because that would mean that the French could get away. Whereas the Royal Navy used to try and fire on the down roll because they wanted to fire into the hull of the enemy ship, kill their gunners, and capture the ship. And generally speaking, the Royal Navy fired a bit faster than the French or the Spanish because they practiced more. And so they tended to fire a higher rate. I will just say to people in the chat, if you want to ask a question that we will definitely answer at the end of the stream, which is not going to be too long off now, you can ask us a super chat question via Entropy, and you will find there's a link to our Entropy site at the top of the chat. Any other points you'd like to make, guys?
Yeah, just one about the Royal Marines, since they've been brought up. Despite what people might think, the Royal Marines, as a permanent body, weren't actually that old by the time of Nelson's Navy. They'd only really been established in the middle of the 18th century. Before that, they were sort of ad hoc organisation, as it were. So drawing from the British Army itself, and even into the Napoleonic French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, you would have British regiments serving aboard ships as Royal Marines.
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes the Royal Marines can actually trace themselves back to the 1600s, but as you say, they started off as an army regiment originally.
Yeah.
But by the time of Nelson, who of course was killed at Trafalgar in 1805. By the time of Nelson, every ship had a regular number of Marines on, depending on the rating of the ship. And the rating of the ship, of course, depended on the number of guns she carried.
Yeah, but the origins of the Royal Marines that you mentioned, Duke, was I think it was Duke of York's regiment of Admiralty Regiment of Infantry or Regiment.
Something like that. Yeah, it is something like that. Yeah.
It was James who would become James II, was the Duke of York in question.
And of course, even today, Royal Navy ships still have Royal Marines on board, so they can do boarding pies and this kind of stuff. So every Royal Navy ship, well, there aren't that many Royal Navy ships nowadays, sadly, but every Royal Navy ship has a Royal Marine detachment. And back in the First and Second World Wars, the Royal Marines used to man one of the gun turrets. When you had battleships and cruisers and stuff, they used to man one of the turrets. So, yes. I don't think there was ever a HMS Siesta built, Haven. There's been a lot of strange Royal Navy ship names, but I don't think there was one of those. Woodpit is saying, was it true about a French ship with a double white hull? No, the ship in Master and Commander, the enemy ship, really should have been an American frigate. That was what they were trying to show. But of course, because the movie was paid for by the Americans and made in Hollywood, they couldn't really make an American ship the bad guys. So they made it a French privateer.
Well, they did say like the ship was built in Boston.
Yeah, they did say that. You're quite correct, Mitch. But Master and Commander is actually the movie, which is excellent, by the way. It's a real good film. If you haven't seen it, do go and watch it. It's much the best movie that's ever been made about Nelson's Navy, and it's very accurate for the most part. And they even used a replica 28-gun frigate. It used to be called HMS Rose, but these days it is called HMS Surprise, and they altered her to make her look like HMS Surprise. But she was originally a 28-gun frigate replica, and so she's pretty accurate too. But the Master and Commander, the movie, is actually based on about 3 of the books, and not very much really on Master and Commander, the first of the Aubrey Maturin novels, because HMS Surprise is not in that book. The Aubrey's first ship is a brig called HMS Sophie.
Yeah, I know. I know with Royal Navy ships, like, was it? I believe, like, in terms of, I think the ships we caught up in Nile, they largely kept their French names, I believe. Or was it like some of them? Yeah.
Some French ships used to keep their name, and sometimes they'd be renamed. It varies. And by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Royal Navy ended up with a hell of a lot of French ships that we'd captured from the French, and also Spanish ships as well. You were talking earlier about the Battle of Cape Vincent, Mitch, and that was where Nelson did his patent bridge for boarding first rates. He was in charge of a 74, which was the most common battleship, a 2-decked ship with 74 guns. And it was called HMS Captain, I believe. And he boarded a Spanish 74 and captured it. And then next to it was a Spanish first rate. And Nelson and his men captured the Spanish 74 gun ship, and then from there boarded the first rate and captured the first rate as well. And it was called Nelson's patent bridge for capturing first rates. So there you go. and Nelson's coxswain, who was, as I said earlier, in charge of the captain's boat, he followed behind Nelson, as they usually did. And Nelson, all the Spanish officers who surrendered, he would hand his coxswain their swords. And his coxswain used to shove them under his arm. So he ended up with a great big bunch of Spanish swords under his arm. Anything else, guys? Because we're coming up to 2 hours, and I generally try and keep these streams down to about 2 hours. Any final thoughts from Mitch or Aaron?
Yeah, I've just add one thing about Master and Commander. As you said, Duke, it's not really drawing much from the book Master and Commander. It mainly draws the plot from the Far Side of the World, which
Is that the one where they're chasing the USS Essex?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
I thought so. Yeah, which is an American frigate.
Yeah.
Although it's really based on again, this is a bit different. It's really based on another American frigate, which was only armed with carronades, which were short, light guns, which gave you a very powerful broadside, but only at very close range. And the real ship that is supposed to be the Essex, I'm not sure if she was really called that. She was called something else, I think. I can't remember. But anyway, the real American ship called that came right unstuck because she ended up fighting a Royal Navy frigate with long guns. And the Royal Navy captain, who was a sensible chap, simply stayed more or less out of range of the Americans and knocked the American ship to pieces. And by the end of the War of 1812, basically all of the American Navy had either been captured by the Royal Navy or blockaded in port. Although they started off quite well. The first 2 frigate actions, or was it 3? 2 or 3, I can't remember now. They did actually capture Royal Navy ships. But you have to remember, the best of the Royal Navy was not off the American coast at that time. It was fighting the French. So the ships that were off in the Caribbean and off the American coast tended to be less well manned and also less well maintained than the best British Royal Navy frigates, which were, as I say, were fighting the French for the most part. But once 1814 came along and Napoleon's first abdication, when they sent him to Elba, loads and loads of Royal Navy ships were sent to the waters off America. And very quickly, all American trade was stopped. And those American warships, and the Americans didn't have many warships, but those American warships that were not captured by the Royal Navy were blockaded in port and couldn't come out, because if they did come out, they'd be captured. So, the War of 1812 started off quite well for the American Navy, but didn't end up very well. And if you want to read about it, Andrew Lambert, who is the leading British naval historian, who's alive today, he has got an excellent book on the War of 1812. And you can also find a lecture he did in the US about the War of 1812 on YouTube, which is pretty good. Anything else, Mitch or Aaron? Anything you'd like to plug, Mitch?
No, not for me.
All right, mate. Aaron, would you like to plug your channel, sir?
Yes, my channel is at Aaron James Hook on YouTube. And I've got, obviously, this coming Sunday at 10 p.m, I'm going to be doing that live stream with Duke about HMS Surprise. Also, I'm going to be doing a live stream on Saturday with 2 authors, Steve Stark and John Davies, as well as my friend Stephen Stoppard, who people probably know, who is very active on X, where we're going to be discussing our favourite spy films. So that should be interesting. That is at 6 o'clock British time, 6 p.m. British time on Saturday.
Okay. I did check Entropy. We don't seem to have anything on there. If you've sent me anything, let me know and I'll answer it in the comments or something like that. I'm looking forward to doing that stream on HMS Surprise with you, Aaron. Patrick O'Brien's definitely one of my favorite authors. And the books are really worth reading. And Patrick O'Brien did a lot of research for them. So almost just about all the actions in the books are based on real ones. So I can recommend that. Okay, guys, I'm going to play us out with an appropriate tune if it works. We'll see if it does. Doesn't always work. It did last week, but some weeks it doesn't. Give it a chance to load. Okay, let's see if this plays. And this is from Patriotic Archive. Do go and check out his YouTube channel. He's got some excellent music.
And adieu to you Spanish ladies, farewell and adieu to you ladies of Spain, for we time to see us again. We'll rant and we'll roar, all on the salt seas, until we strike soundings in the channel of old England. From Ushant to Scilly, 'tis 35 leagues. We hove our ship to with a wind from southwest, boys. We hove our ship to for to strike soundings clear. It's 45 fathoms with a white sandy bottom. We squared our main yard and up channel did steer.
We'll rant and we'll roar like true British sailors. We'll rant and we'll roar all on the salt seas until we strike soundings in the channel of old England. From Ushant to Scilly, 'tis 35 leagues.
Now the first land we sighted, it is called the Dudman. Next Ramshead off Plymouth, start Portland and White. We sailed on by Beachy, by Fairley and Dungeness, and we hove our ship to off the South Foreland Light.
We'll rant and we'll roar like true British sailors. We'll rant and we'll roar all on the salt seas until we strike soundings in the channel of old England. From Ushant to Scilly, 'tis 35 leagues.
Then the signal was given for the Grand Fleet to anchor, and all in the Downs that night for to lie. Let go your shank painter, likewise your cat stopper. Haul up your clew garnets, let tacks and sheets fly.
We'll rant and we'll roar like true British sailors. We'll rant and we'll roar all on the salt seas until we strike soundings in the channel of old England. From Ushant to Scilly, 'tis 35 leagues.
Now let every man drink off his full bumper, and let every man toss off his full glass. We'll sing and be jolly and drown melancholy, and here's to the health of each true-hearted lass.
We'll rant and we'll roar like true British sailors. We'll rant and we'll roar all on the salt seas until we strike soundings in the channel of old England. From Ushant to Scilly, 'tis 35 leagues.
And that, of course, was Spanish Ladies, which is a contemporary song from the period of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. And of course, it's about a British warship sailing from Spain back to England. All right, guys. Thank you very much to my guests, Mitch, Aaron Hook, and AI. I will have Aaron Hook's and AI's channel details in a pinned comment later on. Do come and join us on Saturday, same time, for our normal politics and current affairs stream, Splendid Isolation. We'll be doing that on Saturday at 9:30 British time. And then I'll be around on Sunday to do that stream with Aaron Hook about HMS Surprise, the book by Patrick O'Brien. Go well, guys, and don't let the bastards grind you down.